Does that mean that all of Christianity is bad? No. Does that mean that all of Christianity is oppressive? No. But does it mean that Christianity can be used by harmful, violent people to justify something? Yes. Islam is used in that same way. And so then, the question for me is like, how does it continue and why does it continue? Some of it, going back to sort of my circle of influence, is because our American taxpayer dollars hold it up, right? The reason that a democracy doesn't prevail in Egypt is because they receive a lot of money from us. Their military is in power and we pay for that. The reason Saudi Arabia bombs Yemen, or can continue to bomb Yemen, is because the military-industrial complex in the United States wills it. And, let's be clear, the reason apartheid continues in Palestine is because we fund it. So I've been known to go on a tangent about Palestine because I had the opportunity to visit this past summer. Have any of you been? Yeah, a couple of you? How many of you are from Palestine? Okay. So I had always wanted to go, and I never could bring myself to do it because I am not Palestinian, right? And I know that I have Palestinian brothers and sisters who are not allowed to go. That the apartheid Israeli government kicked them off their land and then took their land.
That is a lie. That is a lie. They went voluntarily to fight. They did not give a land.
I was invited by a Palestinian, right? And that was what mattered to me, is that I was invited by a Palestinian, that someone who had a connection to that land said, Zahra, you can visit. And in visiting Palestine, I thought so much about how I stand on this land right here in California without permission, right? And the necessity of us having conversations with indigenous people. Because when we think about oppression as American Muslims, we often think of it as post 9/11, right? As Americans, generally, we sometimes think of it as like civil rights era, and it happens there. The reality is that America was founded on genocide and apartheid, right? Is that this land was taken from indigenous people. And, you know, it's one thing to very hygienically say genocide and apartheid. What they did, what the European settlers did to indigenous people, was that they wrote treaties with them, and then they broke every single treaty, right? And then they killed them and sold their body parts. So anytime I've ever feared violence as an American Muslim, I thought to myself, but have I been worried that someone would cut off my ear and sell it? Because that's what European settlers did to indigenous people here, right? You would get a certain price for an ear, a different price for a scalp. And it was one price for a scalp of a male and another price for a scalp of a female. And then, of course, it raged with age as well. It's always amazing to me when people want to deny our history, because this really happened, right? It happened right here, including in
This is not your history. This is a lie. Straightforward lie.
Sounds like some folks missed out on the public education system in California. We don't study it in detail. You do have to read Howardson's People's History of the United States to get to it.
I'm not from California.
So, I'm so sorry. You're really missing out then. So, we did that. And when we were done doing that, and if you ever meet someone who is the descendant of an indigenous person, who identifies as an indigenous person, I'll leave you with something that one of my friends who is said to me. She said, when you meet one of us, know that you're meeting the survivor of a genocide, right? You're meeting the less than 1% of people who survived. And when we did that, and when we don't talk about it, how is it that we talk about Palestine? How is it that we talk about Kashmir, right? Is that these histories are interlinked. And so I went to Palestine. It took us several long hours of questioning and inspection before we were allowed to come in. And we saw people who did not look Muslim, people who did not seem like they were activists, right, coming in. And the Palestinians in our delegation were turned away. So there was an incredible guilt in going into this country, knowing that the Palestinians invited us and the Palestinians themselves could not come in. We had the opportunity to spend time in Jerusalem, to visit Masjid al-Aqsa. We were at Masjid al-Aqsa one day, Friday prayer actually, when in the middle of the afternoon as prayers were ending, shooting broke out. And so we had to take shelter in the masjid. We learned as we were sitting there that Israeli soldiers had come into the compound, where they're generally not allowed because there are skirmishes that happen when they come in with guns, right? And they scare people.
Or with bombs?
And so they came in with guns and they started shooting into the crowd and they evacuated the crowd.
That is so not
And we were reminded over and over again in our interaction that I was really
speech.
privileged to be there. Because as an American, I could go to Aqsa every day. I made the mistake one day of asking my sister Linda, I was like, hey, can you meet us? Can you meet my friends at the Masjid al-Fajr? And she's like, my family is not allowed to go every day. Right? If you are a Palestinian, you can't go to the mosque there. And so when we think of mosques and synagogues and churches being attacked here in the United States, again, know that it's not a local phenomenon. We had the opportunity to visit some people in refugee camps, specifically in Ida and Dheisheh. When you think of a refugee camp, what does it look like to you? Tents, right? Any other ideas of what a refugee camp looks like? Yes?
Shortage of supplies.
Shortage of supplies. But it's a camp, right? Like, who goes camping for a few days? I mean, I really don't like camping. Like, I'm always like, I don't know why we're doing this. I want to connect with Allah, but in another way. But you go camping for a few days. You go camping for a few weeks. When I hear the words refugee camp, I think temporary. When you go to the refugee camps in Palestine, they are permanent. Because these families were displaced over 70 years ago and put into temporary camps, except they never got their land back, right? And in their continued effort to resist and to hold on to their legacy, rightfully so, which we applaud, they built their homes on the refugee camps and they said, we're staying. So they're not tents in Palestine, they are literally concrete structures. Is there a shortage of supplies? Absolutely. We were there on a day that there was water coming. And I was like, what do you mean the water is coming, right? Like, my family's from Pakistan, so sometimes when we visit, you get 12 hours of water, 12 hours of no water, and you've got to like figure out when you're going to shower accordingly. This last time I visited Pakistan, that wasn't even a problem. But I was like, what do you mean today's a day that water comes? When are you going to get water again? They said, we don't know. I was like, you don't know? Like, you're not just going to turn it on tomorrow and the water's going to... Right, because how many times do we turn on the water and not think of when it's going to come? And they said it could be a couple days, it could be a couple of weeks. So what was the longest time you've been without water? And one of the families said 3 weeks. How much water can you accumulate in one day in the last 2-3 weeks? I said, what do you do when you run out? And they said, we go to our neighbors. I was like, oh, that sounds basic, cool. And then they went on to say, don't worry, we don't need your help with water. I was like, so what do you need our help with? He said, we need you to go back to our country, your country, and fix the problems that you're causing, right? Like, the Israeli military and its nightly raids in these villages, right? It's shooting of teenage boys, it's breaking up of families would not be possible but for my taxpayer dollars. So when I think of oppression, I think really specifically of my complicity in oppression. Every time I pay my taxes, I choose not to go to jail, right? I choose my life and liberty over the liberty of someone else. Over the liberty of the people in Yemen who are being bombed by Saudi Arabia, over the liberty of the people in Palestine whose land continues to be stolen, but also, frankly, over the liberty of prisoners in California, right, who work slave wages. So if there's only one thing that you remember that I say today, I really hope it is that we are responsible for what is going on. And I don't tell that to you from a place of like, please feel guilty or, you know, like carry this with you. There's a lot to carry. What I wanted to do is for it to force you to ask the questions of what can I do to fix it? It's not always the case that Muslims are the victims. It is also the case, as I mentioned, in Saudi Arabia, in Bangladesh, in Egypt, where we're talking about the government, not the people, right? Where our people are also part of the problem. And so as a Muslim, I'm reminded of the teaching in our hadith that the responsibility of a Muslim is to stand up against oppression, whether it is our brother that is the oppressed or the oppressor, right? It's a really easy question to answer. What do I do if my brother is oppressed? I send them money. I advocate for change. I organize a protest. I go to a petition, right? I write a Facebook post. I mean, that's okay. That's a form of activism too. I write a Facebook post. Like if you've got really snarky tweets, by all means, let that be your activism. Because it's a really good way of reaching a lot of people. But what do I do if my brother is the oppressor, right? Then I stop him from the oppression, right? So it doesn't mean that I only care about Palestine because Israel is the aggressor. No, I also care about Yemen because Saudi Arabia is the aggressor, right? The custodian of the holy sites is also bombing villages, schools, funerals. Those are our brothers. That is our faith. So people say, the other question that came up was, what are the misconceptions about Islam and oppression? One of the first misconceptions is that Muslims are racist, or Islam is racist. There are Muslims who are racist, right? A really great group that I would urge you to work with and that you may have already done some work with is the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, right? To unlearn anti-Black racism in our communities, right? We are not exempt from Black race, from anti-Black racism. Like, we are no better than the average society. But that is not from our faith, right? We know that in our faith, people are equal in front of God except for in their levels of piety. That a non-Arab is an Arab is not superior to a non-Arab, and so on, right? That men and women are also equal, except for in their level of piety, which is the next misconception, is that Islam oppresses women. Whenever someone tells me that, I'm like, yo, like, have you seen me or my sisters who do this work? Like, what about what I'm doing feels oppressed to you? I should have put my shoes to protesters. Like, I'm good, I'm liberated. And I vote, and I yell, and I protest, and I like sign petitions, and I do all of that. But people ask me, but men and women are different in Islam, and they are, right? They absolutely are. And the way that like I've really appreciated being able to explain this is to say that you can be equal but different, right? That you can be equal but not identical. That we have different roles and responsibilities. God, like my mom reminded us so many times as kids that Jannah was under her feet. And you know, I always be like, doesn't my dad feel excluded from this? Like, he does some work, maybe not the same kind of work as my mom, right? But that men and women can be scholars, men and women can be activists, men and women can be entrepreneurs, men and women can be business leaders, men and women can be heads of state. It was so interesting to me in 2016 when America struggled to elect its first female leader, and we've got a chance again in 2020, and it was like, oh, but America is so progressive. And I was like, well, let's count how many Muslim majority countries have already had female heads of state. And so when people tell you that Islam oppresses women, I think it's fair to acknowledge that some Muslims oppress women, but that Islam in and of itself does not. To be honest, we wouldn't be Muslim if it did, right? Like, I choose to be Muslim. I am making that independent decision. And the last misconception that I wanted to touch on as I thought about themes was political dissidence. That Islam oppresses political dissidents, that you can't disagree with Muslim leadership and be okay, right? And I'm reminded that there were people among the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his companions who challenged him, right? Who said, like, where is this war strategy coming from? Is it from you or is it from Allah? Because if it's from Allah, then like, we're not messing with it. But if it's from you, then we think we have a better strategy, right? They would be challenged in their khutbahs. Like, how many times have you sat through a khutbah and like, I really want to get up and yell something? Okay, it's happened to me a few times, right? And that was normal at that time. And I'm not saying that it's like the way that you should go about trying to get change in your masjid now. It probably won't be very effective. But the idea that like you could be different and still be a part of the community. That you didn't have to be Muslim, that you could be part of other communities. This comes up sometimes as Muslims talk about different legal systems, right? And it's to say that even when Muslims were in the majority, there were parallel legal systems. That you could be a religious minority and have your own legal system. You just had your own legal system. And so when people say that, again, Islam treats political dissidents in a certain way, I would correct them and say certain Muslim identifying political leaders, right? Like, gotta be very careful with our characterizing of these people. Certain Muslim majority countries do oppress minorities. And I don't deny that, right? Like, if you are in the UAE and you want to challenge the royal family there, well, good luck, right? Like, they will arrest and torture you and then probably turn you over to the US government. If you are in Saudi Arabia, right, and you want to protest Saudi Arabia, you saw that they executed over 30 people in one day last week, including some people who were teenagers when they committed the crimes that they were accused of. And so does it happen that people oppress political minorities? Yes. And we do that. That happens everywhere, not we. That happens everywhere. It happens in Muslim majority countries and it happens elsewhere. And so, like, gosh, guys, this sucks. Like, this is a really depressing topic. And I'm so sorry, because it's Monday and it's anti-oppression week, and you're going to be talking about this all week. But it's also sometimes necessary to be real, right? To just be clear about what's what. Because if we sugarcoat it, then how are we supposed to take it on, right? How are we supposed to do the work that we are supposed to do if we are burying our head in the sand? This was a conversation that we had a lot when I was in MSA, is to say, like, sometimes our parents want us to be apolitical because they're afraid that being political means that you get followed around by protesters with camcorders, right? Sometimes it means that the FBI visits you to talk to you. Sometimes it means that you're not popular. And so I draw a lot of strength from our history and experience as Muslims. I mentioned that when we think of oppression, sometimes we think of it as a post 9/11 phenomenon for American Muslims, right? Sometimes we think of it as like, okay, maybe a few decades prior when we first invaded Iraq, or if we're older than we think of the Iran hostage crisis. But the reality is that anti-Muslim sentiment existed from the moment that Islam existed. Right, is that this is the cost, this is the price. This is the price of challenging the status quo. This is the price of being fully ourselves. I said that if you speak, if you say things of consequence, there will be consequences, right? We know that Allah tells us in the Quran, do you think that you will believe and not be tested? Remember that was a verse that I held on to a lot as a college student, to be like, oh, things are really easy this week. I wonder what's going to happen next week because I'm going to be tested. Like I'm commanded that I will be tested. But you know when you walk into a final, here at UCI, you're in week 5, right? So your midterms now. So sorry, we had a semester system, and I like never understood why anyone would prefer the quarter system, but it's a great school. You're in midterms right now. When you walk into a midterm, imagine thinking to yourself, my professor wrote this midterm knowing that I would ace it. Have you ever walked into a midterm thinking that? No, because that's not a reality. I'm sorry, right? Your professor wrote that midterm to try to figure out who got the material and who didn't. But when Allah puts you through a midterm, He writes it with the expectation, with the knowledge that you are going to ace it, right? So do you think that you will believe and not be tested? No, we will be tested, but you won't be tested with any more than you can handle. I think of like Americans who go on Hajj. Have any of you been on Hajj yet? Okay, you gotta get going soon. I mean, I know you're inshallah soon. So when you go on Hajj, you will see the people from developing countries, and they're very far away tents, right? And they're sort of like really basic food, and they're long, long walks, and they're very difficult conditions, and they don't have air conditioning in some of those tents. And then you'll see the bougie Americans. They're $12,000 Hajj packages, right? Sometimes $14,000. If you look for a good deal, you can get it for 6 to 8, right? But they have air conditioning, and they have minimal walks, and they've got fancy food, and they've got buses. And you're like, this, how does this make any sense, right? And it's because you will be tested with exactly as much as you can handle. And you know what? Your bus might break down. When I went on Hajj in 2006, I remember my mom prepped me for that. She was like, Zahra, it's going to be hard. And even if you think that you've got it cush, you're going to have it hard. So we were at the Hilton, which like was fancy back then. Now people are at the clock tower, right? And the water went out in the entire Hilton complex. I was like, oh dang, this is my test, right? Like, and it's so simple, it's so basic. I've thought about this as I've gone through my divorce. I've thought about this as I've gone through difficulties at work. I've thought about this as people have protested me and my organization. Is that I will be tested with exactly as much as I can handle, right? And so my responsibility is to push the limit, is to say, okay, like Allah, like I believe, now test me, right? And I'm gonna get to work. I think about that and the strength of the African American like slaves who came over here at the beginning of this country, and they practiced their faith in quiet. They practiced their faith in hiding. They practiced it with the fear of torture. How many of us like think that we might risk being tortured when we're about to pray? It's not even a thought that crosses my mind, right? Like people are like, oh, aren't you afraid? And I'm like, no. Like it's not, like it's just not something that's even in my psyche. And so can you imagine the strength of our brothers and sisters who did that, right? And if that's what they prayed through, then who are we, right? Who organized escapes, who organized protests, who organized to escape. Like a lot of times we talk about Muslim history in America as though it's just in the last 50 or 60 years, but the reality is that Muslim history in the United States extends to the beginning of this country, and it's an activist history. Those early slaves, right, worked hard to hold on to their faith so that we could practice our faith comfortably. We know that there is no compulsion in religion. So, you know, if the test gets too hard, you make your choices, right? Like I am not here to say, hey, you have to be this kind of protester, or you have to be this kind of activist, or even that you have to pray this kind of way. We often talk about that in like the context of the belief of religion, but I also want to be clear that the MSA should be, the MSU, should be a welcoming space for people in all of their forms of activism, right? That we welcome everyone in all of their forms of activism, but that we also take a position that we will work to defend our faith, that we will work to defend the rights of other people. We can never take more than was taken from us. So, you know, if our guests ever have an event and you want to show up and take your 1990s camcorder to their event, you are more than welcome to do that. You absolutely should. You are well within your right. Right? But if you want to show up and like throw eggs at them, you absolutely should not do that. Right? You don't get to do more than they did, and you always carry yourself with an air of dignity. You always carry yourself with an air of respect. You set the standard. And so we have our work cut out for us. Guys, like, I don't need to tell you that we're permitted to protest, right? Like I made that note and I was like, oh, I should tell them that we are permitted to protest. No, I want to tell you that I actually believe that we have a moral obligation to protest. That we have a moral obligation to do everything that we can. If you are in this room on this campus, some of you are undocumented. Some of you have food insecurity, right? Some of you may not have a place to live. You